Football at 4 is powered by the Inside the Birds podcast. It's brought to you by Bet365. Whatever the sport, whatever the moment, it's never ordinary. At Bet365, the Eagles have made their decision. It will be Kevin Patullo. He is the new offensive coordinator for the Philadelphia Eagles, and he replaces Kellen Moore. Kellen Moore, of course, took Doug Nussmeier, the Eagles quarterback coach, to New Orleans with him. Also, assistant offensive line coach T.J. Paganetti is now in New Orleans. So the Eagles needing to reshuffle the deck on the offensive line front. And, of course, they have Jeff Stoutland there, but T.J. Paganetti is a name that many people might not be familiar with. But you start to pluck guys off the staff, and then we ask, what does that mean in Philadelphia? As that's what happens when you win. They come after your guys. It did not go well for them after they went to the Super Bowl a couple of years ago. Geoff Mosher from the Inside the Birds podcast is back for Football at 4, and Mosher will start off there as I'll ask you that question. You know, last time the Eagles went to the Super Bowl, they got a lot of coaches plucked off their staff. They did not rebound from that very well. Do you think that could be a similar situation in 2025? That, hey, you lost Paganetti, you lost Nussmeier, you might lose a guy here or there. You're going to need to bring in a new quarterback coach. You now have a new offensive coordinator. Is that a concern that, hey, you lose that stability and now you take a step back?
Losing coaches is always a concern, especially when you have to replace them in high-profile positions like offensive coordinator and quarterbacks coach. I would say the difference this time around is that the defense so far, for the most part, is unscathed, and Vic Fangio isn't going anywhere. And as much as we talk about the Eagles, problems on offense last year that led to a new coordinator and quarterbacks coach, the real problems last year started with the defense and the discombobulation, and that you don't have to worry about so far, even if they do wind up losing someone. Vic Fangio and most of his coaches will be back, if not all. So that'll be big. And by making Patullo the offensive coordinator, the expectation, Mike, as we've been reporting on Inside the Birds, is that he's not just going to go back to running the offense that he knew from Indianapolis or with him and Sirianni and Steichen. He's going to keep very many of the same concepts that were there last year with Kellen Moore. So what they're trying to do is trying to keep it as stable as possible, as opposed to going outside and trying to find someone who has a completely different organizational philosophy.
Yeah, give us your insight, Moshe, on what you've heard, what you know about Kevin Patullo. He's been a guy around here 4 years now. I look at him and say, okay, pass game coordinator, wide receivers coach. Do we anticipate this offense shifting its focus a little bit more to the aerial attack?
I don't see that happening. And like I said, I think that by promoting Patullo, the point is to keep things as close to last year as possible. And now every team wants explosive passing offense, and every team wants to get their quarterback into rhythm. So if they find that in year two of, well, I can't say year two of JalenHurts, but more year two of Jalen being more in charge of the offense, setting the protections, and then in a similar style of offense that Kellen Moore was running, that he's more comfortable like he was in the NFC Championship game and the Super Bowl, where he arguably played his best stretch of quarterbacking all year, then sure, you can see an opportunity to keep opening the offense and improving and building. But I think that in general, they will look to be as similar as they were last year and hope to build from that, more so than trying to do anything radically or even, half radically different.
Jeff, there's two sides of the coin here. Everybody's kind of had their opinion. Now that the dust has settled and it has actually happened, they stayed in-house. The continuity is there. Do we look at the last, this offense and say, man, that was such a great offense that you should really just keep with it? Or should they have explored a more veteran play caller and maybe that could have added more to this offense? Or do we like the trajectory of where, did I say that right? It sounded like I messed that up a little bit. Trajectory of where this offense was going and stick with the same terminology, the same philosophy and streamline that? Or would you have rather them looked at a more veteran play caller?
Yeah, the difficulty is, we talked about this last week, as you get this far into February, it's hard to find guys that are out there that you want to bring in and think can make a difference. I know that from the fan standpoint, I've heard the name, Frank Reich tossed around there. And maybe Frank could join the team as a senior advisor. But, Kevin Patullo coached under, and Nick Sirianni coached under Frank Reich. So you're already getting sort of that input there. I think you would have had some danger in trying to go out and find somebody who maybe doesn't fit what you want to do. They did that last year. They were fortunate that a guy like Kellen Moore was out there, and Kellen Moore had already produced a couple of number one offenses in the past, and is a young guy and was a good guy to have in here. I just don't know that they felt that they needed to do that this time around.
Yeah, Patullo, I guess the question would be, a couple of years ago, they brought Brian Johnson in, and this now looks to be a Sirianni decision. Mm-hmm. Was that how you read this?
Yeah, I mean, obviously nothing gets done without the stamp of approval from the GM here, and sometimes the owner. So I'm sure that there was a say in it. They liked Kevin Patullo when Nick Sirianni joined as head coach. I'm sure the discussion in the interview was, hey, I'm going to bring this Kevin Patullo guy, and Patullo was respected.
Why did they pass him over the last time?
You mean last year?
No, when they hired Brian Johnson.
Yeah, that's a good question. Brian Johnson was a guy that they also liked and had been a play caller in college before and had worked with JalenHurts. Remember, he was a guy who had worked with JalenHurts in the past, and I think that there were some real attractants to that. And, I think we can have a really long, nuanced discussion about whether Brian Johnson truly was a problem or not with the offense last year. He went and if his job is quarterbacks coach and you're evaluating the quarterback that he coached this past year, you'd have to say he did a pretty darn good job with Jaden Daniels, right? And now he's not the play caller, so that's a little bit different of a story. And in this case, I think Patullo is now ready, even though he is. And listen, this is the roll of the dice. Kevin Patullo has not called plays at the NFL level before, so this will be his first time. I believe JalenHurts was sort of alluding to that last week when he was interviewed, and he stopped short. He said Kevin Patullo's never, and then he kind of went into a different direction. So that's obviously going to be the challenge. It'll obviously be the, I don't want to call it low-hanging fruit to grab if things don't go well, but it'll certainly be discussed if things don't go well, that, his lack of play calling experience. But I understand the decision to want to keep it in-house, but this time you're keeping concepts from the guy who was here the year before. So even though it's not Kellen Moore, you're keeping a lot of the staples of that offense in place. And do remember that a lot of the offense this past year, while it was Kellen Moore, did have some strengths or some accents to it that came from Nick Sirianni and not just Kellen Moore.
This is what Britton Covey told us at the Super Bowl 2 years ago in Las Vegas when he talked about how difficult it is for an offensive coordinator on how to manage. You got Super Bowl champions now. You're not walking into a group of guys who haven't done it. Now, this is what Britton Covey said in Vegas.
It is learning how to manage all of those different talents. It's a lot harder than it looks. People think it's so easy because one game we throw it to AJ for 6-game stretch and he has 125 plus yards.
Right.
And it's like, let's just keep doing that. And then teams start keying on it. And it's like, why aren't we just running the ball with Swift? We've got Swift. It's a lot harder than it looks.
So he's saying it's hard to manage all these guys. And that was when they had Swift. Now you got Barkley.
Yeah, well, that's the beauty is that now you have Barkley. So I think Kevin Patullo automatically starts off on a better footing than his predecessors did, Brian Johnson, because when all else fails, if you give the ball to 26 about, 20 to 24 times, it's probably going to be a lot better of an outcome for you.
No doubt about it. Well, and that's where I go back to, with Kevin Patullo, who's been a pass game coordinator, does he have are there more layers, peels of the onion to his passing game that we never saw?
Well, that's a good question. And this would take an even longer conversation. But, I think, really getting into Kellen Moore's head, you would have to ask him if he felt he truly had his best year as a play designer or a play caller, as opposed to some of the years he had the number one offense. He tried to do a lot of different things early on. Some things worked, some things didn't. And as the year went on, they ran the ball. And I believe that they drew up an offense that catered best to what JalenHurts does best, a lot of outside the numbers throws, which we saw in both the NFC Championship game and the Super Bowl. And I would say that Kellen Moore probably had to adjust what he had done in the past with Justin Herbert, with Dak, with whoever he's worked with, because when you work with different personnel, you have to adjust to it. And so as it pertains to Kevin Patullo, he's at least been in-house and he knows what Jalen Hurts' strengths are, and he knows what Jalen Hurts' weaknesses are, and he knows the same thing from Kenny Pickett and Tanner McKee, right? So whatever we think he is based on his pedigree in Indianapolis or here in Philadelphia, or whatever we think he might want to do from a passing game concept standpoint, it really is secondary to what he thinks he needs to do to get, continuously get good quarterback and good offensive play.
Here's Britton Covey at the Super Bowl in 2023 in Las Vegas. He's explaining why it's not good to just make drastic changes. In other words, why you don't just bring somebody from the outside in.
I advocate for Coach Sirianni. It's the same thing that I did with Coach Clay last year. A lot of people didn't want Coach Clay back, and I'm just like, people don't understand. Like, you have to give people some time. You can't make drastic changes in every department. You need to make some changes for sure, and we did this year, right? But sometimes the big flashy change isn't always the best.
Interesting. Like he's saying, you got to give people time. The problem is people keep plucking guys away from the Eagles, and they're not getting the time. And now you wonder, okay, Kevin Patullo, as a young guy, if he's...
I would disagree a little bit with Britton, Mike.
Okay, go ahead.
And listen, he's a smart guy. He articulates himself well. But the first thing I would say is, first of all, that interview was not this was like 2 years ago, right?
This was in Vegas, correct.
Right. I think you have to have a little chops in the NFL, both not as a player, but maybe as a front office guy and as a coach. Otherwise, an opinion is just an opinion. So I'm not really sure what, and I'm not trying to sound critical of Britton. What I'm just saying is I don't know what his experience is as a coach to be able to say that. He's giving you his player standpoint. As a player, you want continuity, you want the same coach. So that's his opinion from his vantage point. I would tell you, though, that a lot of GMs, a lot of personnel people, even head coaches who have power, would say, if you make a hire, right, and you think you got something but you didn't get, you have to be strong enough to cut the cord quickly. And you have to be, Jeff Lurie cut the cord fairly quickly on Doug Peterson, considering the guy won a Super Bowl and then went to the playoffs 2 straight years. So where I would disagree with Britton is, if you're strong in your convictions and you didn't do the right thing, or you feel like you have an issue, then you do need to move on and not worry about continuity, because the worst thing you can do is to keep somebody in your house for quote unquote more time when you're already convinced that somebody really isn't the guy.
Well, keep in mind, again, this was back in Vegas. So he was, I guess, saying when people were critical of Brian Johnson, he was suggesting that, hey, we kind of kept the continuity from the team that went to the Super Bowl instead of bringing another voice into that team.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm saying? So I think at that time they thought the continuity was better than bringing an outside voice in because of the success they had the year before. And then, of course, we're having that discussion as they lost 6 out of their last 7 games and the coordinator gets fired.
Right. I don't know that there's a right or wrong answer about whether you emphasize continuity or talent. In my mind, it would be talent. They had a chance to bring in Kellen Moore, who had, number 1 offenses in the past. I think twice. So they did, and he, came in here and they won a Super Bowl because of it. Now, did they win a Super Bowl because he brought that level of talent, or is it because they upgraded the personnel on offense and gave the offense a home run hitter at running back that never had? That in itself is its own question.
This is the last bite. Now, we're bringing this back because, they bring in a new coordinator. So this is some conversation we had with Britton at the Super Bowl 2 years ago. But it's kind of a similar situation where they promote it from within to a guy who's never been a play caller. Here's what he said about their offense in 2023 and their offense in 2022. Now, remember, the 2022 offense was significantly better than the 2023 offense.
We ran the same offense in our Super Bowl year. So Nick Sirianni's offense that wasn't the problem. The problem was adjusting to how teams played us.
So he was saying it was adjusting to how teams played them, and he furthered that by saying he thought as the year went on, they never really changed. Like, people watched them in 2022, started to see what they were doing in 2023. And by the end of 2023, it was like, you guys haven't done anything differently. And that's where you look at this hire and say, should they have a little variety different from what they did in 2024?
Well, it does sound like they'll bring in, they're going to bring a pass game coordinator who's from the outside, although, he coached with Sirianni and Patullo in Indianapolis. So how much can we call Parks Frazier an outsider? I don't know. I think this just goes back to, and I'm not trying to minimize coaching at all. I think coaching in the NFL is more important than any other sport, but it sort of goes back to having Saquon Barkley along with what you have in the passing game. If Kevin Patullo finds that defenses are going to sell out now and adjust to stop Barkley in 2025, well, he's already seen that if you do that, you've got some opportunities to hit your two prolific wide receivers on the outside in one-on-one situations. I don't think Brian Johnson had that same kind of ability because DeAndre Swift's a good back, but he is not on his best day anywhere near Saquon Barkley. So the Eagles have sort of safeguarded themselves to say, all right, now try to stop us with your best scheme to either stop our run game or stop our passing game. So that helps out the offensive coordinator a little bit when you can be multidimensional that way, in a way that they weren't able to be 2 years ago.
Now, you said Swift is very good, but he's not Saquon Barkley. Did you expect Barkley to have that significant of an impact on the offense?
I did not. But my biggest question was, could he stay healthy? He stayed healthy. If you told me Saquon Barkley was going to stay healthy, I figured he would have a good year. 2,000 yards? No, did not figure that because you would have had to have figured on the Eagles admitting it as an organization. That it would be
well, what I said, Moshe, when they signed him is, okay, you had Swift, 1,000 yards. You had Sanders, 1,200 yards. To me, to justify the bill on Barkley, I said he's got to have 1,800 total yards. Well, he got 2,000 yards passing, so he was justified.
Yeah. He said, I'll see your 1,800 yards and raise you a few hundred more.
We're talking with Geoff Mosher from the Inside the Birds podcast, which you can get on all podcasting platforms. Yesterday with Adam, we talked about some free agents, but one guy we brought up was Dallas Goedert and his contract situation. Do you see him or other veterans that the Eagles might have to make decisions on as cap casualties? Now the cap's going up $22 million. Does that change the outlook on any free agent decisions?
Well, Adam and I rail against the term cap casualty because most of the time, if a guy is moved on from in a trade or release, it's not because they can't afford him. It's because they don't want to pay him because they're not getting the return on the investment. I feel like the last true cap casualty might have been when Dallas had to let DeMarcus Ware go, right, to Denver, and then he won a Super Bowl because they literally messed up their bookkeeping so bad that they could not afford DeMarcus Ware, but he was still a tremendous player who gave tremendous value. Most of the time, you just see teams decide to move on because they are not getting the return on the investment. With Dallas Goedert, when he's healthy, they get a return on the investment, but his issue has been not staying healthy. And here you come to a season where he's out of guaranteed money. So that's normally when a player says, hey, especially one who's good, like Dallas says, I'm not going to play anymore unless you redo my contract and give me some security. Now, if he were to say that to the Eagles, I'm not saying he is, I'm just saying if he were, then the Eagles would be like, we can't, you haven't stayed healthy. You're a good player when healthy, but we can't sit here and guarantee money now when we need to get younger and you have not proven to be able to stay on the field as much as we're paying you to stay on the field. So then the situation can come to a head a little bit. The Eagles don't have a replacement for Dallas Goedert, so they don't really have leverage in that regard, but they've not been afraid to move on and play younger players like they did when they moved on from Javon Hargrave, right? And went to Jordan Davis and Jalen Carter and Moro Ojomo.
Yeah.
So this one will be interesting. It'll be interesting. I'm not saying he's out the door, but I think that there's going to be some headlines about this.
I told Adam yesterday, I think, that my priority, and, the Eagles don't have a priority. It's all dollar-based. But I got to bring Bond back, and my reasoning is I don't want to draft a linebacker. I don't have enough value on linebacker to draft one. I'm willing to draft a guard. I'm willing to draft a tackle. I'm willing to draft an edge rusher. So for me, I don't want to waste a pick. I don't say waste, but you know what I'm saying. I don't prioritize that spot in the draft. So I'm going to pay the guy that's here and then have to not worry about that position for 3 years.
I mean, that makes sense. And certainly it would be hard to find another story like Zach Bond, who comes along once in a generation, right? Especially for the Eagles. I think it's all going to come down to, does one team in free agency get like silly, stupid, crazy and say, we need to have Zach Bond, and the top of the market, I just don't think he's going to get like Fred Warner money, which is like $20 million a year. Tremaine Edmonds, $18 million a year. I forget who's making 19. There's another inside linebacker that I'd be shocked if a team did that, because it's basically just been a 1-year thing for Zach Bond. But Matt Milano at 14 a year, Patrick Queen 13.75. That's probably the floor, right, for Zach Bond. Probably, I don't know, but I would guess. And if that's the floor, it's going to get pretty interesting come negotiation time.
No doubt about it. And that all starts March the 10th. March 12th is when you can make it official. The 10th is legal tampering, and that is less than a month from now. Obviously, a lot of rumors and speculation between now and then, but the cap is going up by $22 million, which should make some people a little bit more money, and we'll keep our eye on who's going where on the Sports Bash Live. This is Football at 4. He is Geoff Mosher from the Inside the Birds, from Birds. Wait a second.
Yeah,
I'm so
right.
lost today. From the Inside the Birds podcast, which you can get on all podcasting platforms. I got it right the first time. It says it right on the bottom of the screen. I should be reading it right off of there. I have no Josh today, so I'm a little low. I don't have my read sheets in front of me, right?
No, well, then it's like, you're Nick Sirianni without Kevin Patullo.
Although Josh wasn't here today, and he got me those Covey bites that I asked for.
Nice shot. Look at you making this man work on his day off. What's kind of
when something enters my head, I'm like, where are those Covey bites from? And he knows where they are. I don't.
The most irreplaceable man at 97.3. No offense.
All right, man. We'll talk to you.
See you, brother.